One of probably the most challenging parts of writing is figuring out where you want to take your idea, right? A lot of people will say, I have an idea, but I don't know what to do with it. I don't know where to take it. You know, I think that can be a very, very challenging aspect. And that is part of the reason that I think some people have said that they have tried to turn to AI to help them flesh out an idea. So that begs the question, what do writers who don't use that as a tool, how do they or we come up with ideas? How do we flesh out an idea? Because an idea is not a story, right? Having a concept is not the same as having a plot. It's not the same as having a subplot or characters or anywhere to go with the story. You need something a little bit more and a little bit substantial. So, how do you come up with it? And a lot of writers, I think, including myself in the past, you kind of have a bad habit of just hand waving it away like, oh, it just, I was inspired, it just came to me. It's very hard often to explain how exactly it is that ideas come to you because, or like when you're writing and in the process of writing, how you actually flesh out an idea to be more than just a simple idea. And so you're kind of floundering like, how do I explain this in a way that makes sense? And I guess one of the first things to say is that sometimes you just have to sit down and just look at an idea that you have and try to think of where you could or would want to take that story. I know that sounds very vague, but like it does require you to kind of sit with a story and look at it and say, where do I think, like, what do I want to include in this? What is something that I want to do with this story? What do I want to say with this story, right? For instance, I am currently working on a story that is a fantasy, right? Or I guess it's more of a what the hell is the term? Oh my god, not magical realism, it's the other one. I can't think of it right now. Anyway, it's like I'm working on that. And when I first came up with this idea, I knew that I wanted to write something that was kind of different than anything else that I had worked on. I wanted to have the whole secret world. I wanted to do all of that thing, but also set against the backdrop of a very real world, right? And so I that was kind of the central idea. That much I knew. And I also knew that I wanted to have this very specific character who you know, was more like goth inspired, right? And those pretty much were the only two things that I knew. I knew that I wanted a story that was like fantasy set against a real world, and I knew urban fantasy. Oh my god, I couldn't remember that. I knew I wanted an urban fantasy, and I knew that I wanted this character to be goth. That's it. And so I then had to sit with that and say, okay, where do we go from here? What is this world? You then have to figure out, what is this world? What is the secret world? What is the real world? And how do these come together? How does this character find out that they are of some kind of, supernatural origin, let's say? How does that happen? How does that manifest? And then you go from there. And yes, like, I will not deny that, like any author, you're gonna probably, especially in the beginning, take inspiration from other stories that you've read and other things that over the years have built up in your brain of just, tropes that you like and how can you do that differently. I've said this before, I think a lot of books these days are kind of a little trope dependent. I think we get very perhaps bogged down in trying to do tropes and trying to put tropes into our books as much as possible, and I think that can be a bit limiting, honestly. And so I think and it's not a bad thing to have tropes, certainly. I think there is certain motifs that come up in fantasy, right? There's the chosen one motif. I think that's very common in fantasy. I think the idea of someone discovering themselves and not knowing who they are is a very common trope in fantasy. There is also the sort of fantasy trope that's like the fish out of water thing of someone discovering they're part of this fantastical world and having to deal with that and having to sort of come into this world. Those are all very big common tropes in fantasy, and that's not a bad thing. That's certainly not something that you should, say, oh, I can't do this because everyone does it. I'm not saying that at all. But you do have to recognize that, like, there are ways to sort of not circumvent, but certainly retool those common tropes. You don't have to include them. You can, but I think also being able to say, hey, what if we turn this on its head a little bit? What if we take the sort of, chosen one thing and turn that on its head? What does that look like? What does it look like if you take a character who's maybe supposed to be the chosen one, but they don't work out that way? If you look at something like Star Wars, to pull an example, the whole point of the prequel trilogy is like Anakin was supposed to be the chosen one, but he turned to the dark side. That's a very interesting and compelling way to turn that narrative on its head. I'm not saying you have to do that in a fantasy version. I'm just saying that is very compelling. So I think being willing and able to sort of think of these things and think of, different ideas and different tropes and things that you maybe see in fantasy that maybe you enjoy or maybe you don't enjoy, and you want to think, how can I do that better? How can I do that differently? You don't have to do them differently, certainly. There is no expectation that you have to, change a trope, you have to do it differently, but you do want to do it in a way that is your own. Find out something that you can do with that trope that makes you happy, that makes you interested and curious. You're really writing the sort of story that you want to read, right? I think that is the key to being a writer, is writing the sort of story that you want to read and that you would enjoy.